There are two basic types of animation timeline available in Photoshop. A lot of people don't know about the timeline in Photoshop at all. I've known people who've used Photoshop for years and never explored that. Right now I have an image open and the timeline panel. If you don't have the timeline panel showing, you can go to Window, select Timeline, and you'll get this panel. Now I'm going to use this image to demonstrate frame animation. There are two choices here: create a video timeline, create a frame animation. For this image, I'm going to create a frame animation. This is the oldest form of timeline in Photoshop. It used to be a separate program called ImageReady. Basically, the idea was you make images in Photoshop, and ImageReady was a program to prep images to go on the web. So it'd convert things to GIF files, JPEG, things like that. But with GIF files, there's of course animated GIFs, and so it had a timeline where you could create sequences of images, output animated GIFs, and put them on your web page. That's all been incorporated within Photoshop and has been expanded upon significantly over the years. Having created a frame animation, it just took my image. We have a single frame here with a 0-second delay. It's one of the weird things about frame animation is like you don't have a timeline where you have specific times laid out. You have frames that are held for a certain length of time. If it says 0, that's the minimum amount of time, basically. Okay, so if you followed my photo retouching demos, you recognize this image. And the reason I have this is that this image also was created with a bunch of layer counts. There's a layer count labeled cropped, one labeled clean, where it's been retouched, a layer count called gray, where it's converted to a grayscale, layer count Picon, where you have a high contrast version of the grayscale, colorized, which is a pseudo color version of the grayscale image, and then, creative, just to have something non-photorealistic to end with. Now, the reason I'm demonstrating this with the frame animation is that, if I double-click on one of these layer counts, you see that the things layer counts remember are the visibility of layers, the position of layers, and the appearance. That is, if there are layer styles, drop shadows, emboss, anything like that, it remembers the settings for those things. And it just so happens that those are exactly the same things that you can animate in this timeline. You can turn layers on and off, basically animating the opacity of a layer. You can move layers, and you can animate the settings for a drop shadow. So a drop shadow can become deeper, softer, change its depth or density. Okay, so following along these lines, I'm going to treat those layer counts I have as keyframes. Now, keyframes, if you are not familiar with doing animation, is particular frames where you specify like the position of different things, and then you create tweens between the keyframes. So that, there are key points in time, and then you create tweens between them. So here I start out with, I don't want to start out with this one. Let me select cropped here. I'm going to start at the beginning of the animation with this image, and then I'm going to create a new frame, and I am going to animate to the cleaned up version. Now, the way I do that is I'm going to add frames in between here. So with the second one selected, there are different ways you can do this, but I'm going to proceed this way. Let me move this over a little bit. I'm going to go into the panel menu here and say I want to create a tween. So between my selected frame and the previous frame, I want to add a certain number of frames. Now I'm going to output this video at 30 frames per second. So I basically want to add 29 frames in addition to the current one to have 30 frames. Now if I do this consistently, I'll end up with an extra frame at the end. Now I'm going to tween all of the layers because I have a lot of different layers over here. And I'm just going to do all of them. And I'm not changing the position, I am changing the opacity. There are no effects here, but having them all selected is fine. So I click OK, and it's added a bunch of frames. Now notice one problem here is that as it's fading some layers in and fading some layers out, there's some transparency to deal with here. So since this is a video, I'm going to go down here and add a background. I'm going to fill this with black. Okay, so now that takes care of that problem. And I'm just going to lock this layer in the background. Now if I play this, I'm going to go to the first frame, play, and it's looping here. You see the magenta triangle from my cropped image fading out and the other image fading in. So that's basically what I want. Now to proceed along here, I can just go to the end, add another frame, which is a duplicate of my current frame. And I'm going to go in and select grayscale. Okay, now I'm going to do the same tween. All layers. Okay, so it's added another 29 frames. And I'm going to go ahead and add another frame. Select high contrast. This, could maybe even do with fewer frames. In fact, this time when I tween, I'm going to just do I'm going to do 14 to account for that extra frame I don't want at the end. Okay, so just going to do a quicker, more like a half-second tween here. Then I'm going to add another frame, tween to the colorized. Now it remembers what I did before, so if you're doing the same thing every time, it's really easy. So now I'm going to go to the creative. Instead of going into this menu here, you can actually use the tween button here. It brings up the same settings. Click OK. And we're to the end. Now, I want to loop back to the beginning. So I am going to do this one more time. Select my original cropped image, tween. Now going back to the beginning, I notice that again, I have this transparency to deal with. So let me take care of that. I'm going to go in here to my layers, and I see that I did not have this when I started. So I'm going to turn that on. Actually, one trick, I'm going to go to the first frame. it says propagate frame 1. What that means is that if you make a change on frame 1, it'll carry that through. So I turn the background off and back on frame 1, it'll turn it on for the whole animation. So that can be really helpful because we have 165 frames here, and if you want something to happen throughout the animation, that's a handy thing there. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead, go to the beginning, and hit play, and we see now there's a limit to how fast it can play in Photoshop here. Okay, so it's playing through. The first time through it was really slow. It's picked up a little bit, but this is the architecture of Photoshop isn't designed for playing sequences of images as well as like a program like After Effects. After Effects would just play this very smoothly. Something this long, this resolution in Photoshop, it is straining my system a little bit, together with like recording the video and all that sort of stuff. But that's one type of animation. Now, to get this out of the computer, there are different ways of doing that. One thing I should point out, this icon here, convert to a video timeline, the other type of timeline. It'll take this and basically create a video layer out of that, and that would play more smoothly. But I'm just going to go over here and output this. So this is export, render video. Got a dialog on the other screen here. me003.jpg. There are a number of options here. It says JPEG, which is a still image, and outputting a sequence of still images is one option here. So, there are 165 frames in the timeline. I could output all the frames as JPEG files, and that's a really well accepted way of dealing with things in terms of, many different programs can read sequences of still images as an animation. I'm going to go ahead and tell it I want to use the Adobe Media Encoder, output this using the H.264 format, which will create an MP4 file, which is the most universal thing currently, whether you're on a Mac, Windows, wherever. This is the de facto standard currently, until H.265 is better adopted. 30 frames per second, that's what our timeline was set up as. This will be about 5.5 second long video. Make sure you know what folder it's going into. And click render. Okay, so here's the MP4 file. The image I was working with was about a 5:4, basically a 10:8 aspect ratio. So I have black bars on the sides here. I hit play, and it smoothly cycles through the 5 or 6 images. If I put this on loop, it'll play that forever.